Thank you for your paper. I'd like to challenge you on the human in this humanism of the other, because it seemed very much like the source of this ethics is responding to the defiguring of a human face, which seems to me to almost veer close to an essentialist gesture, where there's a humanism, as you say, of the other, and it's recovering this humanism or doing justice to it. Whereas it seems to me Stiegler moves away from this conception of ethics precisely because the ethical imperative comes from the inhuman. It's preventing becoming inhuman, which means becoming non-inhuman is the ethical imperative. So rather than positing the human as the source of responsibility, it's fighting it's fighting the inhuman to produce the human anew and in different ways, rather than positing the human as the source of ethical responsibility. And I wondered how that would affect your views on Levinas particularly.
So is the tension for you whether or not the notion of the human is the source or the aim of both techniques and ethics?
Or both, yeah.
Yes, I guess I don't see that as necessarily a tension, and that's where I think precisely this transductive relation between techniques and ethics might be fruitful, is to work out those places where, if ethics begins with this notion of the human, which is precisely this. Levinas talks about the hypothesized individual. There needs to be, even though the other is absolutely other, that is beyond my comprehension, there needs to be an I that emerges, a human I that emerges to respond to a human other with a physical face, although the face goes beyond any traits of the face. And so if that is ethics, maybe, I don't think that it would be possible. I think it would be necessary to think about ethics with techniques in order to fight against the non-humanizing of where we began. Is that still in intention for you?
I think it's the very individual basis of the face of the other that you seem to put forward. It's an I. You see what I mean? Whereas
the I, as in the yes, the
whereas
I.
Transindividuation precisely destabilizes this as a point of origin for thinking and ethics, and that's the point: to become non-inhuman together in a collective process of transindividuation.
Exactly. Yes. Which is And what I'm trying to propose is that techniques isn't possible to think without ethics, and ethics isn't possible to think without techniques because of these tensions. At the same time, the collectivity. I mean, how can we say that collectivity is possible? That also needs to be challenged, the collective individuation, and the basis on which this collective transindividuation occurs also needs to be challenged, just as this I that emerges out of the idea of non-being needs to be challenged as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that point.
Thank you very much for this lecture. Extremely interesting.
Thank you.
And I'm really happy with your analysis, because generally the discussion between with people, with readers of Levinas is extremely difficult for me, and it is the first time I find somebody who opens really a fruitful way for this discussion.
Thank you.
I'm really extremely happy with that. And this is also this question of ethical and technical is the core of the question of general organology. Generally, myself, I avoid to use the word ethics because it is too much now misused by capitalism, particularly ethic of capitalism, etc. It's now there are departments in business schools dedicated to these questions.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy with your communication, and also because you open a new way for those who, like me, try to think after Derrida on the question of trace, because the discussion between Derrida and Levinas was over-determined by this question of trace, and this question of trace was thought with architrace, not in the way you use here. Now, one suggestion I would like to address to you is to continue this path toward dusting, because I believe it is extremely important to revisit the possibility of connection between
That's extremely helpful. Yeah.
these questions and Lacan's analysis, because in Lacan there is a very, I quote it in one of my books, there is a very small discourse he gave in Belgium. The title is Letter to the Catholic, and where he says techniques is a condition of sublimation. And I think behind this very short discourse there is a possibility of reinterpretation of the question of dusting, which is extremely interesting for the point of view of trans-individuation particularly.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. There was very much in it, so this is just one small point. At a certain moment, you said you contrasted the ethical to the mere moral program.
Okay.
Right. I suppose my response to that when I was listening was. Yes, but the moral program is actually really important, and in some ways it's the only means in which we can actually collectively intervene or interfere or work towards something more ethical. So I just wonder what your comment was about that.
And that goes back to the law, too. This was the question of the law we were talking about yesterday. And I mean, that is and speaking of the dialogue between Levinas and Derrida, Levinas' whole piece on the law, and there's still this in that piece, at least, there's still this disjuncture between ethics and as justice and the moment of law.
Force of law?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's always a point of contention that is probably worth not just dismissing as irreconcilable, but should be thought together. Yeah. So thank you.
At the beginning of the conference, it was invited that people who aren't particularly familiar with Bernard's work ask some questions, so this is going to be one of those questions.
Well, you're going to be asking someone who's not familiar.
Yes. But only because the difference between humans and non-humans made such a large part in your talk. It's just a question of what that difference is. Particularly when writers in cybernetics, genetics, cognitive sciences are starting to blur the boundaries and ask whether or not the specification of a certain, in a sense, Cartesian sort of man isn't in itself problematic to the fixing of certain pathologies or medicinal problems, however you want to put that. Whether at some stage we might not just kind of have to get rid of the human thing altogether.
This is precisely, I think, would be the core of what motivates my whole project. Is this in the context of the post-human condition, and the reason for hanging on to a humanism of the other isn't a Cartesian kind of human or this essential man. It would be more along the lines of what Martin Crowley, I don't think he's here, would talk about and would phrase in terms of a politics of finitude of this vestigial, some sort of vestigial remnant of what is human. And there is a beautiful anecdote that can be found in Levinas's Carnet that really illustrates this beautifully. It talks about, so he wrote these Carnet, these notebooks, these notes while he was a prisoner of war during the Holocaust. And in it, there's a story about how the workers, at the end of the day, would come back, and we can't imagine the physical, like what is remaining of the human is not there, and so they're barely recognizable as a human being. But there's this dog at the camp who comes running towards them and wags his tail. So that, to Levinas, spoke of how, at least to the dog, not even, if not for the persecutors, at least to the dog, these were human beings. So that's what I would say, the reason for holding on, even if the human being might say there's no difference between that dog who welcomes me, or I don't know. It's worth thinking about more in terms of this, that precisely that why does that dog respond that way to the human being? Go ahead.
If I may, the problem for me is, what if I don't want to be human? What if I want to become that other thing as well? Isn't
and I think that's precisely the characteristic of a human being who can think that too, have the cognitive capacity to think such things and invent such things. I don't know. I'd love to continue this conversation. There was
just to come in on the previous point, you can want all you want not to be a human being, but that doesn't mean you can stop being one. On a very basic level, we are evolutionarily different from other animals, which isn't to say that we fall outside the phylum of the animal. We have different relationships with technology. We individuate ourselves through culture rather than at the level of the gene, as Bernard would say. And this may only be a matter of degree rather than a difference in kind, but I don't think that it's meaningful to want to simply abandon the concept of the human like that. And on the contrary, I think that we need to be very wary of doing so. If we look at the discourse of anti-humanism that comes out of people like Deleuze and the Génération 68, there's a real sense in which they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that the cost of that is that we see in Deleuze it's all too easy to get co-opted by capitalism, and the notion of, to put it in Richard Rorty's terms, we become so open-minded that our brains risk falling out, or to put it in Deleuzian terms, this desire to become inhuman lends itself all too easily to exploitation and dehumanization in the workplace, because in this affirmation of becoming other, we're simply being invited, in the sense of Nietzsche's Übermensch, to open ourselves up to the challenge of affirming whatever gets thrust in our direction. And that just becomes a legitimation of this discourse of adaptationism, which is the most pernicious underside of economic Darwinism. And I think that what we're really seeing at the moment is this commodification of that discourse of the Übermensch, that discourse of Deleuzian becoming. And what we need is to reassert a not inhuman concept of humanism that isn't simply an invitation to let ourselves be bestialized in Bernard's language.
Thank you.